How's that? Yep, got it.
Yeah, well done. Welcome everybody for this October session of PCNV. I am recording this. I have remembered this time to turn the recording on. So Chris is going to tell us all about process theology and so forth. So on you go, Chris.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. First of all, I haven't changed my name. This is my wife's computer, and I've had a bit of trouble with my Zoom, so she's kindly loaned me this computer. And yes, I would like to present something for less than half an hour, probably about 25 minutes. I have enough to go for about 2 or 3 hours, but I'll edit that as I'm going through. And it's a very big area, and it was really many years ago when I went to Toronto to do further study. I focused on religious epistemology, which is a very big word, epistemology. When I was a chaplain at Carey, I always loved to say, when I was in Canada, I did epistemology. And of course, you know exactly what the 16 and 17-year-olds, they just about went through the floor that I was using such a naughty word. And anyway, of course, it's knowing how you know. It's the methodology of knowledge. And a person who's big in that field is Alfred Whitehead. He was writing the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, and he invented a particular model of, some people would say, of metaphysics, and that is the sense of meaning within science, within religion, within a whole range of different areas. He was a mathematician, as many philosophers are, but he turned more to philosophy in the middle of his life and eventually to metaphysics, and really was interested in the whole notion of the movement of what we call God in the world. He does use the word God in his writings. He was a philosopher, but his notion and understanding of God is very different from traditional religion and traditional philosophy. Metaphysics itself was really almost invented, I suppose, by Aristotle in about the 4th century BC. He didn't mention God. He talked about the unmoved mover and a range of different ways in which he talked about this flow of creativity within society and within thought. And Alfred North Whitehead, he picked up that basis and then moved into his own particular area. So let me just begin, and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end and comments, particularly comments. As I said, it's a complex and varied area of thought and understanding. But I think, and I can't prove it, but I think it's probably the most effective philosophy base foundation for the Western world today, particularly if it is linked to understandings of Buddhism, which is probably in some ways fits very comfortably into Buddhism, and it also fits comfortably, I think, within Christianity, but not traditional understandings of theology and such. It will challenge many aspects. But I've been using it now in the church for probably, I don't know, 15, 20 years. And I found, provided I don't tell people they've all got to change their mind, I think it's a very effective way of understanding the contemporary world in which we live, and also, of course, how theology intersects with that world. Let me just read a little bit that I've prepared here. Process theology, or process thought, holds that the fundamental nature of reality is change. Everything is in process, constantly evolving and interrelated. Instead of thinking of the world as made up of unchanging things like atoms and substances, you'll know that in the creeds we get the word substance because it's a great Greek philosophical concept. Rather than being atoms and substances, process thinkers, and this is the part that will test our minds and our hearts, I think, thinkers see it as made up of events, moments, moments of experience or processes that are interconnected. So it's not going to be about stars and moons and shapes and that kind of notion. It's going to be about thought through that, flow through those things, the thoughts that we have. That is the process through which life is being moved into the future and so forth. As I said, the origins are through Alfred North Whitehead, but also his student, Charles Hartstone, who I think was the theologian John Cobb. Hartstone was his teacher, and he went on to take Whitehead and Hartstone's thought and put it into theology. So let me give you a few of the key concepts of processed thought, and we'll eventually come to process theology and progressive Christianity. It's becoming is more important than being. Reality is an ongoing process of becoming, not a collection of fixed identities. Now you'll start to see how this would clash with traditional understandings of Christian theology. Relationality. Every entity exists in relation to others. To be means to be in relationship. Creativity. The universe is characterized by creative advances. New possibilities are continually emerging. God and the world. In process theology, God is not an all-controlling ruler, but a participant in the world's ongoing processes, influencing and being influenced by. And so it's applied to philosophy, challenges classic metaphysics, as I've mentioned with Aristotle, that prioritize permanence over substance. It qualifies that. And theology, it offers a dynamic view of God, of the world, of human freedom, rather than a static view. So God created the world in 6 days and then he rested. And process theology wants to move beyond that to the notion that God is continually creating as we are continually creating. Science and ecology, it resonates very much with the modern understanding of evolution, ecosystems, interdependence, and possibly quantum physics or quantum theory. I used that in a service, and the very kind man came up to me after. He said, well, I'm a professor of physics and I know a lot about quantum physics. Why don't we have coffee together? So it was a sort of a sense in which, I don't think I quite got it right. So it's a very big area, of course, in modern thinking, but it's an interesting one. So in single terms, process thought says reality is not made up of things, but of happenings. Everything from atoms to people to galaxies is constantly in motion, shaped by what can become and shaping by what comes next. Process theology comes out of process thought. So as I mentioned before, John Cobb, who's one of the leaders in this area, was a student of process thought and then brought it more focused into theology. Process theology is the religious application of process thought by John B. Cobb Jr. From the philosophy of Alfred Whitehead and Charles Hartstone, he re-imaged traditional ideas about God, creation, and the universe in a way that emphasizes change, relationship, and co-creation rather than divine control and immutability. The other thing about process is that it doesn't like the omnis. You know, the omnis of theology, particularly Christian theology, omnipresent, omnipotent. All of these are fixed categories, whereas process wants to put in the sense of movement and flow and change, which seems to me to be really what life is. So we've got classical theology and Alfred North Whitehead's approach. We're not looking at immutability, omnipotence, or transcendence. We're not so much concerned about creation out of nothing, We are concerned about the freedom of creatures, our freedom that we have, our free will, and so on, and what that means. Prayer can be seen within a process understanding, its participation. Salvation can still be seen. We can take these words which have come from traditional theology and really reinterpret them as salvation is growth. It's not a one-off experience. It's actually part of the creation, and we are continually being, inverted commas to use Paul's and the Apostle Paul's words, continually being saved. Now, you're going to have to do a fair bit of work in terms of finding language that brings that about. And God is not distant, omnipotent, but rather God is dynamic, empathetic, and a co-creator. So process theology teaches that God and the world are in dynamic relationship, both affect each other. God is not an unchanging, distant ruler, but a living, responsive presence. The universe is not a finished creation, but an ongoing process in which God and all creatures participate. So the key beliefs: God is relational, deeply connected with the world. Every event in creation affects God's experience, and God in turn influences the world with divine love and creativity. God is not all-controlling. Instead of coercive power, God acts through persuasive power, inviting creation towards goodness, harmony, growth, love, all of the values that we might hold. God is encouraging us. And the word that's often used in process theology and process philosophy is God is luring us towards those values that can reshape our understanding of who we are and reshape our actions and so forth. God changes in some ways. That is in process theology, God can change. Jonah, of course, it says that God changed his mind and relented on the command that they would be destroyed. God's character and purposes are eternal: love, care, creativity. That's the universe is moving towards that, which may not seem to be the case when we look around the world, but we need always the long view. And what is happening now is part of the ongoing process. So even suffering is actually woven into this creation in which we live. Creativity and freedom: all creatures have some degree of freedom. So self-determination, God offers possibilities, but the world is free to respond, meaning that the future is open. It is not predestinated. So salvation and meaning are not escapes from the world. Heaven and hell is not the destination that we're moving toward, but participation in God's ongoing creative presence, contributing to the growth of beauty, love, harmony, and the universe. It will take a lot of internal thought to really re-image God. We're not talking about an anthropomorphic understanding of God, but rather a metaphorical one. So we can use the string of metaphors. God is the mountain, God is the stream, God is the life-giving force. All of those metaphors can be applied to God. And look, I think you can apply father, mother, and other metaphors. They are metaphors. God can't be a father. God is God, and God is that. Yet the metaphor that we use carries with it the sense that God is in a relationship with the creation. So what matters? Process theology attempts to answer the tough questions that classical theology struggles with, and particularly the problem of evil. The problem of evil: if God doesn't control everything, then evil and suffering aren't the result of the divine will, but of creaturely freedom and the risk of an open, evolving world. We live in a risky world, And it's the choices that are made that will actually lead us in one direction or in the other direction. And so when I say we, I don't mean just us. I mean the whole of creation is somehow making a choice. And so evil is part of that process, not made by God, but made probably by the paradox of freedom. And you can choose to do evil things, or you can choose to do things which are in harmony with the ongoing processes of love and so forth. And so it also incorporates science as well as faith. It fits naturally with evolution, cosmology, and ecology. And we can see each of those aspects, I think, in the modern world today. Creation is a continuous, interconnected process. Spirituality, it presents as compassionate, participatory in the vision of God. One who feels with us, that is God, and works through relationships rather than through domination. In simple terms, God is not a distant king who dictates the world. God is the loving companion of all creation, consistently working with us to bring more beauty, justice, joy, and being into the world. Process theology represents several key Christian doctrines, giving them a more relational and dynamic meaning. The traditional theological view, how are we doing here? I've got another 15 minutes and I'll finish with that. Traditional theological view and process view. Traditional view is God created the world out of nothing by the act of absolute power and will. Process, creation is continuous, not a one-time event. God and the world are co-creators. God continually offers new possibilities for creation to realize. The universe is unfolding in process, and God is the creative partner, not the distant architect. Traditional view, God is omnipotent, able to control everything. Process thought, God's power is persuasive, not coercive. God doesn't force outcomes, but gently lures the world toward, well, not always gently, but lures the world towards a greater harmony, beauty, and love. And that may be a very painful experience. Divine power is the power of love's invitation, not of domination. Prayer asks an all-powerful God to intervene supernaturally. Prayer is participation in the process view in God's creative process, aligning ourselves with God's will so that divine influence can flow more freely through us and the world. The view of Jesus Christ, the traditional view, Jesus is the unique Son of God, fully divine and fully human. Jesus is the process view. Jesus is the fullness and the full revelation of God's character. They use the word perfectly. I always struggle with this word perfectly, but perfectly open to God's persuasive love. I would say completely open to God's persuasive love. He shows what it means to fully respond to God's calling, God's luring, God's presence in the world. In Jesus, we see the clearest expression of divine love embodied in a human life. Sin and evil. Sin is the disobedience against God's commands, and evil is often permitted by a divine plan in the traditional view. Process view, sin is resisting God's creative lure, choosing lesser possibilities. Evil arises from the freedom and the complexity of creation, not from God's will. God suffers with creation, but constantly works in transformation to transform the pain into a new possibility from good. The person I was most influenced in that particular view was Jürgen Moltmann, who wrote the book on the churches, the Messianic Church, in which he talked a great deal about that sense in which God participates in the suffering of the world. And also you'll find it in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's writings as well. And so salvation, in the traditional sense, saves the soul's sins and brings them to either hell or heaven, whichever way you want to go. I think I prefer heaven rather than hell, but anyway. Salvation is, in the process thought, salvation is ongoing healing and transformation, both personal and cosmic. It means cooperating with God's creative work here and now. Salvation is not an escape from the world, but the renewal of the world through love. And the afterlife, as I've already mentioned in brief, we know what it is in a more traditional view, heaven and hell, or death and something else. Process theology, every experience endures forever in God's memory. So God is that which is certainly beyond our imaginations and yet enters into our imaginations. Nothing of value is lost. Eternal life is participation in God's everlasting life, not a separate realm. We live eternally because our lives are woven into God's own experience. Now, I know that this is sometimes a bit wordy, and also it can test our thought patterns, because they certainly do have a complexity about them. The church is the traditional view, of course, is the church is the institution through which God's grace is administered. Process thought, the church is a community of co-creators collaborating with God to bring more compassion, more justice, more creativity into the world. The church is less a fortress of certainty and more a laboratory of love. And that comes from John Cobb's writings. I mentioned before, Aristotle was the great one who brought metaphysics into our world. And metaphysics, to make it as simple as possible, is a philosophy, it's a branch of philosophy that studies the fundamental nature of reality, of existence and being. It asks a question that goes beyond science and can measure, that science can measure directly, focusing on what reality is at its most basic level. Now, can I say that metaphysics has not had a very, very strong emphasis in philosophy in the last decade, in the last 100 years, the last millennium. There was a big move, of course, in philosophy towards words, the study of language, and so forth, and you couldn't say anything. What was Wittgenstein's famous statement? You don't speak about those things you don't know anything about. And so metaphysics was not really a major issue. And so people like Whitehead and others were pushed somewhat aside, but picked up by theology much more than philosophy. But I think that seems to be changing in the world today. There seems to be a movement to, whether it's called metaphysics or whether it's called spirituality, there is a move towards looking at our very basic sense of consciousness, of reality, and so forth. The questions like, and let me just run through a few of these. What does it mean for someone to exist? What is the nature of being and reality itself? What is the relationship between mind and matter? Do we have free will, or is life determined? What is time? What is space? Are they real or just conceptual? Is there a God or some ultimate cause or principle behind everything? Well, there's plenty of discussion about does God exist and things like that. They're not the type of thing, does God exist, that process thought is really that interested in, because it's then dealing with a being, it's dealing with a substance rather than dealing with a process. It can just be that there is that which brings the creation through to some kind of end. So the main branches of philosophy today are really ontology, cosmology, philosophy of mind, philosophical theology, and all of those are located within process theology. And you can buy a book called Process Theology for Dummies, and it's a great one to read because it does give it much clearer and easier understandings. So today, modern science explains much of the physical world. Metaphysics explores rather than proves, explores conceptual foundations, the assumptions beneath philosophy, consciousness studies, ethics, and logic itself. So it's a broad church in that way. Let me just finish with this one thing. One thing I wanted to say is that if you're interested in it, the center of process theology is Claremont School of Theology in California. And that's where John Cobb died at 99 last year. but the whole school of thought has continued through that particular place, and they study a lot of that. But just to say something about progressive Christianity and why process could be very much more important. A number of progressive Christians already kind of adapt theology. I think one of the differences of process is a philosophical theory. Process is that, whereas progressive Christianity is more of an action. Now, obviously, it was formed against interpretations of the Bible. There was a part of that. And of course, much of progressive Christianity has continued to talk about metaphorical theology and ways in which we can understand our actions and that through not literal understandings of the Bible, but poetic, artistic, and other forms of interpretation that are very important. And of course, there's a big emphasis on action through justice, not just action through following what God says we should do. So that sort of names, I suppose, and you know as much about progressive Christianity as I do. It does stand against, at times, traditional Christianity, and particularly those things that traditional Christianity avoids, such as non-literal understandings of miracles, of heaven and hell. Progressive Christianity, of course, will see the metaphorical dimension of Christian faith in the Bible, not necessarily, that's not necessarily part of traditional. Well, traditional classic theology, of course, is as broad as we possibly can get. There's many views that people hold, and some of them will relate to what I'm talking about and others will not. Progressive, just to say, how does progressive theology relate to progressive Christianity? Progressive theology is dynamic. It's a relational view of God, resonates with progressive Christianity's openness, its willingness to reinterpret Christian faith and also, of course, the text of the Bible. And it also, progressive Christianity has a strong ethical concern. So does process thought. It focuses on co-creation. That's progressive Christianity and process theology. Both stress human responsibility in shaping the world, aligning well with social justice and ecological activism. Both of those, progressive Christianity and process theology, both do that. And both are now this is I use the word flexible doctrines. I don't know if that is the right word to use. Process theology allows progressive Christians to maintain a robust spirituality without insisting on rigid dogmas like God's unilateral omnipotence, omnipresent predestination, and other issues like that. In short, process theology can provide a philosophical and metaphysical backbone for progressive Christianity. That sounds a little bit strong, but it certainly can work together. Social, ethical, and theological ideals, as well as ecological ones as well. Many progressive thinkers see it as a way of reconciling faith with modern science and plurality, which is a very important part of progressive Christianity. So in the future, progressive Christianity, process thought, we must grow among younger generations who view inclusion, social justice, and spirituality over strict doctrines. And that's not all younger generations. Some younger generations, particularly when we cast our eye over the United States, embrace a very rigid doctrinal approach to Christianity. But I personally see that the future is in that capacity for us to be inclusive of other religions, social justice, and so forth. Each, both progressive and process, each must continue to diversify, incorporating insights that come into our view: psychology, environmental science, interfaith dialogue, and so forth. It must be willing to face resistance from conservative Christianity, which will either polarize or clarify, which either will polarize us or hopefully will clarify the identity of a Christian faith. And it must increasingly prioritize lived ethics, community engagement, and open biblical interpretation, relevant contemporary theological constructions over formal systematic theology. One of the sermons I preached a few years ago, I said, there is nothing systematic about theology. What we really need is an unsystematic theology. That is one that is open, not to dogma, but is open to a much wider view of Australia. So that, I think, is enough to say for now. I've certainly got much more I could say, but I'd like to leave it there and give opportunity for people to comment, question, and so forth. Thanks, Miss Hartwell.
If people are wanting to, I've unmuted. If people are wanting to say something, you can unmute yourself and say now. Yep, Les, did you want to?
Oh, yes. I have a question for Chris. So thank you very much, Chris. I'm just wondering whether Whitehead himself aligned himself with any particular religious tradition and what his view was of Christianity in particular.
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, the simple answer is no. However, he always, I think, maintained some connection with the Anglican Church, with the Church of England, and no, he never really put forward a Christian view as such. He saw it as a universal view that he was looking at, and religion was a part of that rather than the leading force of it. He was a philosopher. He wasn't a theologian as such, and so therefore he wandered around many various ways of understanding the world in which he lived. Might I say, and I don't know if I made that strong enough, he was criticized by many people for not following a more rigid scientific view, because he was a mathematician, and he and Bernard Russell wrote mathematics together, and so he came from that background, as many philosophers have, of course. Wittgenstein and others were mathematicians, and they saw the world through a very particular way in terms of mathematics. He really moved against it. John Dewey was sort of part on board, but part not. He didn't like too much of the metaphysics, and same with William James. They were all contemporaries of Alfred North Whitehead.
Can I ask a question?
Go for it, Ken. Sorry.
Okay. Thanks very much, Chris. That was a great, concise exposition. It seems like you had it written down, and it would be good if we could get a copy of that rather than try and take bits and pieces of notes. That was excellent. I'm just wondering if the training of ministers today, uniting churches where I'm from, include process theology, and whether that's part of the curriculum as you understand it.
Okay. I think no, I don't. It's not. It's often put forward just as a possible alternative. It's not really seen as the basis, which it is meant to be, of a particular theological way of seeing the universe, the life, the world. Of course, in many places, the Neo-Bartian kind of model is the one that tends to be put forward in a liberal kind of way. So there would be certainly fundamentalist colleges, but most of the major colleges are not fundamentalists. They're probably conservative, but they don't necessarily follow this particular model that I'm mentioning. You know what? I don't really care whether theology colleges do it, because I think I would like to see it as progressive Christianity has been much more of a, inverted commas, lay movement, that it comes from the bottom up, so to speak. because it really is something that can fit well into people's theology, understanding of the world. And it is a world universe-based approach. It's not a churchy kind of theology as such. It certainly can be, it is applied to church as community, but it's not really applied to church as institution, if I can make that distinction between the two. The community is in communication with the divine, with the sacred, and that community can speak through the life of the Spirit into the community, into the society, into the world, and so forth, and into the theological colleges, which probably is an important part of it. As I said, there are theologians who would say this is the basis of my theology, and that'd be all around the world. But I suspect that they are still a relatively smaller group than, say, the traditional theology. Certainly my experience was always that it was, I was aware of it, but very much so, but very little of it. Yeah. Thanks, Ken. I don't know if that helps or not.
Greg, your turn. Just need to unmute yourself, Greg.
I've unmuted now. First of all, thank you for a very informative and enlightening presentation, Chris. I just thought I'd ask you for your comment on if the divine, or God, if I want to use that word, is part of the process in terms of relationship rather than a puppet master. Perhaps the divine is finding its way too.
Yeah.
Like water running down. If I turn on the hose at the top of a mountain, it finds a whole lot of dead ends where it can't find its way through, but eventually it finds its way to the valley where it forms the river. And do you think, to me, I sort of think that sort of helps me understand why, I'm metaphorically picturing a God up there, right? But God's part of the process, and with even the worst atrocities in human history, saying that didn't work out too well. It have to find another path that works towards love. So as well as just process theology, developing our understanding of metaphysics and everything, it is actually a process of not only us reacting in relationship, but whatever this mystery is behind everything of divine reacting in a relationship of love and learning. So the idea of a perfect God doesn't exist anymore. God is perhaps on a journey with process theology foot. Could I have your comments on that, especially relating to how do you think those ideas would relate to the world at large? I've had quite positive thoughts when I talk to people who are not of any sort of faith, your average person in the shopping plaza sort of person. And I just wondered your comments on it, please, Chris. I hope I haven't spoken too much.
Yeah, certainly. Yes, I mean, the move to atheism is part of the sense in which, God is, why are we talking about something that is meaningless, the word God. And we know there are, I suppose, Greta Bosberg in Canada is one of the people who wrote Without God, the book, because the word God became meaningless, within the whole context. And I must admit, on Sunday mornings, I use the word God a lot. And I probably need to spend 6 months on talking about that word. How do we interpret it and so forth? And that word, of course, conjures up a whole range of emotions and feelings and thoughts and so forth, because it's so embedded within our culture, and particularly our religious culture. So I'll bring to it my understanding of what I think that word means. And it is a word. I loved Michael Looney. He was interviewed many years ago, and he said, and the interviewer, who was the interviewer, Anne? Do you remember the guy who did the interview? Doesn't matter. I just asked my wife who was the interviewer. He interviewed him, and he said, you use the word God a lot in your cartoons, and I know you're not really associated with any religious group as such. What do you mean by that? And he said, well, he said, yes, you're right, I do use it a lot, but for me, it's the shortest, most meaningful poem I know. So he used it as a metaphor, that word. I think that with Whitehead, he may have used the word God on occasion, but he saw the way in which we could relate to this flowing movement, almost of spirit in the world, that some would call God and some may call something else, because the name was not so important as the very factor of what was happening. And it was a happenstance, it was experience. How have you encountered this flow through the universe? How have you found it, and so forth? And of course, this type of thinking is cosmological. It's not churchy. And of course, most of our theology, and as Ken has sort of indicated, and particularly theological colleges, is formed within the church, because that's where we are. You know, we have I'm a minister, I have a target audience. That's the audience I talk to. So my theology gets shaped within that kind of thing. That's not necessarily a bad thing, that's a good thing, but it limits sometimes the capacity for us to think cosmologically. I mean, you only got to bring, to some people, I mean, at Highfield Road, where I am at the moment, there's a very big commitment to climate, to dealing with climate change and so forth. And they are seeing their role as cosmological, and that is, well, we're not worried about Pluto so much, but certainly we're worried about the Earth and how we deal with those issues. So the broader it becomes, the better it is, but unfortunately for all of us, the more complex it becomes. If you can get a simple answer that God did this and we did that, it seems to, you can sleep at night a bit better. But if you're kind of trying to hold in tension a whole range of different cosmological, teleological, all of these theological constructs, it can be very disturbing for people at times. And for myself, I don't fully understand that. It's not just people, it's me. Yeah. Thanks, Greg. Anything else? Yeah.
Wes, your turn to ask something.
Thank you. I want to follow more on where Ken Tabart was a little while ago, because my understanding of process theology is that's exactly what it is. It's a process. It's a living organism. And unfortunately, with the shrinking in physical number, but also the shrinking numbers of people in formal training for ministry compared to what I experienced over an 8-year period, is becoming alarming to the point that process theology is a very low-running agenda, and we've gone back to a much more formal, this fascination we have with the basis of union in the Uniting Church, for example. In practical terms, it was what has got us over the line to union. It was never intended to be a massive doctrinal statement, and we've gone off in this formalism that has no meaning. And yet at the same time, process theology, you mentioned Monifer before in your presentation, it's also to do with social engagement. And for example, we observe the total silence of the church, almost total silence of the church in the United States and even in Australia, to what I call Trump apostatism, where the whole of Christianity as we understand it has been colonized in the way the Nazis did in the 1930s, and we remain totally silent about it. But we then talk about process theology as some academic sort of afterthought. How do we engage the church once more in a way in which we are challenging people that are in pulpit situations or in congregational situations, rather than letting them get away with what I call theological rubbish? I worship as an Anglican church because we're not the Uniting Church here where we live has gone in a direction that I don't want to go in. But they're faced, for example, all the bishops are ascending of all places in the Sydney diocese next week because there's been a motion by GAFCON that they are going to dissent from not only the appointment of the new Archbishop of Canterbury, but literally to split the Anglican Communion over a fascination with the 39 Articles as though they were locked in some sort of process theology from 400 years ago. So where do we actually engage where the general populace who's abandoned religion can actually come back into the point that we actually have something to say rather than be reduced to utter irrelevance? So it's a very long-winded way of getting off my plate.
No, you've pretty well, as each of the questions have hit it on the head in many ways. There's a retreat into formalism, as you've mentioned, particularly I think with the inability for those of us who are more liberal to really get our message toward a larger group of people who are not in the church or have left the church and so forth. I think the first thing is that we don't really try church growth. We don't try to make the church bigger. I think that would be a violation of really what we are here to do. The other thing I would think is that it's the long game. Is that the meaningful word? And that is, Christianity has taken 2,000 years, but I've been reading Facebook recently and people are still waiting for the rapture. The evangelical rapture that we're going to be taken away. It happened on 16th of October. So I'm still here. So that means I didn't obviously get sucked up into the ether up there. But in that sense, in what our culture probably pushes us in towards short term. Everything has to be that way. Now, I can understand that's a difficult thing, particularly if you're in a difficult situation. You want it to end. But if the process is that this is a necessary process to go through, and if there is, inverted commas, faith and trust in the movement of this process, as you said it well, Wes, when you talked about, the flow of it, rather than trying to hold it together. One thing I know that I haven't quite worked this out, and please, you can just forget it if I got it wrong, but the big thing in quantum theory is the capacity to measure the velocity of something and the location at the same time. You can't do that, of course, because it's moving and it keeps moving past. And process attempts to reconcile that in some way into our life. But it means that we have to be a part of that flow. We are moving as it is moving. So God is moving, the creation is moving, we are in motion, we're all moving together. Now, that may not be very satisfying for those who are in a difficult situation. I wouldn't go to somebody who's suffering and say, oh, well, just hang in there for another year, 2 years, 5 years, 50 years, 100 years. Slavery took how long to at least have some advantage over, but not much. There's still slavery in the world today. And those kind of social interactions and movements, it can take hundreds of years. I can recall reading a paper on the Quakers. The Quakers I've lost the figure, but I'm going to say 1785 in America, that they had a conference and they could only get 90% of the people to agree that slavery was a sin against God. 10% didn't. And they said, when we get 100%, we will do it. Now, I don't always agree with that type of thing, but 40 years later, the whole of the Quaker movement put forward that slavery was wrong in the context. And all the Quakers who owned slaves, and there were many of them, gave them freedom and moved on. So that process can be painfully slow and agonizing. And it may not be agonizing for me, but it can be agonizing for other people. So what do you say, Wes? What give me something here? Because it's certainly a major issue in terms of if you do hold a process, it's going to take time, and patience will be a part of that process. And in that time, we've got to maintain that we will not stop and say this is the way it is, and it will never change on that. And that's what theology has tended to do. Here I stand and I ain't going to move. And that approach will not necessarily help us in terms of the future. I think your illustration, I'm new to the Uniting Church, 15 years or something, and the use of the statement of
basis of union.
Basis of union. Thank you very much. So you see, I really have imbibed the whole thing. The basis of union. You're right. It's not a theological doctrine. It's a way of bringing three congregations together, and they should hold to our name, uniting, not united. So uniting is process, isn't it? You know, we are.
Well, it was, and I'm looking at a former president in Jill Tabard as well, but from the perspective of, I mean, it's 60 years since I started to train for ministry, but the Uniting Church was present continuous tense. It never had, it had obviously a beginning point because they were the three originating denominations, but it was uniting, and it's like we've come to a dead end and we abandoned ecumenical engagement a long time ago. And we've gone off in little pockets of what I would call self-selective interest, whether there's social welfare or some little theological little pocket we can hide in, but we're not engaging the community as we once did. We used to pride ourselves on being the third largest denomination in Australia, and now we're just a footnote. And from that particular perspective, that's the danger in terms of how we talk about process theology, because it's no longer just an intellectual exercise. It has to engage the spirit as well. Otherwise, and it comes back to your point about our understanding of, as we look, and most of us are looking closer to the end of our life journey rather than the beginning. What is our relationship with God that has meaning and is ongoing beyond life as we currently experience it, that gives hope and encouragement, rather than abandoning people to a sense of loneliness because in the denomination that I'm ordained in, there's this overwhelming, the vast majority of colleagues that I know worship in another denomination or just don't attend worship at all. And there's just this massive sense of grief that they've given a life to something. Was it a false dream? Was it what happened? You know, where was the vision of 47 years ago that suddenly is evaporated, or 48 years ago now? That's the process part, that when you talk about the difficulty, how do you handle the entrance into the demise of a denomination but still live in the Christian hope? That's probably a very long-winded way of trying to answer you.
Well, that's a good question for the whole group. It's very important to engage and to find ways in which we can communicate, not just stand on a, well, I don't know. We don't tend to stand.
Hello.
We tend to hide our being or something in some way, that we don't probably work hard enough to find out how we can do those things. That's just my experience. Others may have different experiences of that. Thanks, Wes.
Go for it, Wes. You're obviously ready for another question.
Thanks. So, Chris,
I was giving the thumbs up to say, I agree, but I've dominated too much. Thank you.
Good on you, Wes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in.
Right. Was it Les?
Go for it, Wes.
I think it's Les, isn't it?
Is it?
Go for it, Les.
Yeah, waiting for Les.
Les. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. We've got too many Leslie, Wes, all very confusing. Thanks. So it's process theology has got a lot going for it. I mean, it's quite attractive, especially for someone who's scientifically minded, a naturalist like me who accepts the theory of evolution, quantum field theory, cosmology, The universe is some 13.8 billion years old. So that's all quite attractive. The extra elements that come in particular, the teleology, that the universe is moving towards a particular end. So one, the teleology; two, the imbuing the universe with some moral dimension.
Yes.
So those two aspects. To some people, that could seem like, and this is a challenging question for you, Chris, to some that could seem like just a so-so story. What evidence is there for the teleology and the moral dimension over and above the scientific naturalist part that many of us accept?
That's you right. Just a couple of points. Teilhard de Chardin, who's a paleologist and theologian, does talk about the omega point, that it is kind of moving towards something, but it's a theological construct. What type of evidence can be that, and move to the second part of that about morality? What evidence is there that this universe is a place that's moving towards morality? It's easy enough to say, we can say, well, we haven't arrived yet. That's, and I just said that before, about we need patience because it's actually a process. But having said that, it can be also a bit of a cop-out, because when we look at the world, it doesn't take very long to see the Holocaust and other terrible experiences that have happened, in virtually an hour, not in my quite living history, but very close to it, that does not see it very moral. And even today, you can look around and see it not very moral. Is it possible to see evidence of a morality beginning to emerge, or rather a morality that's always been there, but is gaining momentum in maybe the smallest way possible, that it is gaining momentum? Is there evidence? What would the evidence be? Now, Steven Pinker from Harvard, the professor of psychology, he says it is. He says that there is evidence that, for example, one of the things he uses, the role of empathy. When people used to watch people being executed and cheer them as their head was chopped off, he said doesn't exist today. Now he says, don't see that as a linear thing. He said we have them going forward and then coming back, because if you go to some places, you will see people cheering when their heads are chopped off, or you will see those who have been deeply affected by something as putting forward revenge rather than any sense of a moral kind of way in which they see the bigger picture. So there is, I think, I haven't got it, but if there is evidence that this creation is moving in a position that towards what Alfred North Whitehead has said, then I'm in there if there's evidence. But there is no scientific evidence as such. Maybe evolution gives us a bit of a scientific, that we can see the changes in human beings, perhaps. Are we better than where we came from 400,000 years ago? Well, I just heard my wife say no. And that'll be one of the answers, of course. Of course, we have to recognize that there are aspects of our being today that are probably not. And the interesting thing we've noticed, we've been watching a bit of Attenborough and Jane Goodall, and that is that the intelligence of animals is being emphasized more. The intelligence of trees, how trees somehow communicate with each other through their roots and so forth. So there is an interesting movement, and it's good to say interesting. Everything, when you're a philosopher, everything's interesting, but it doesn't mean you've got to do much. You know what I mean? It's got to be transformed into action, and also action that we can see, not with our eyes, but also see with our being in some way. I don't know. You've stumped me already. See, and it's now and I got to go and have dinner or something. It's 5:05, so I have to leave it there. I do have this paper, and we're quite happy to put it onto the net, onto the our site, and you can have a look at it from there. I do have to give a bit of a clarity that I am a bit of a fan of AI, and some of this you'll see if you can look at it, was coming from ChatGPT. So I'm not as negative towards AI as I hear other people speak about it. It's how you use it, as all things.
Chris, have you got time for one more question?
Yeah.
John, your turn. Lucky last.
Thank you. I'm a bit of an outlier here. I'm a Queenslander for a start, and I'm also from the Catholic tradition. I think the personal issue is one where, what do you do when the teachings that you have grown up with and are in the view of new human knowledge are incongruent? So you start to question the teachings that you have believed for most of your life. And that's certainly a struggle that I have tried to come to grips with in my retirement over the last 15 years. I'm glad that Chris mentioned Teilhard de Chardin, because he and one of his student or colleagues, Ilia Delio, has sort of, they've certainly pushed the process theology bandwagon, and I've come to the conclusion that process theology for me is the best explanation of God and my relationship with the world than any other particular theology. Mind you, there are bits and pieces of other theologies that are part of that. I suppose liberation theology, feminist theology, you could go on. But I particularly would encourage people, if they don't know about Ilia Delio and the Centre for Christogenesis, that they have a bit of a look at the website for that person.
Yeah. Yeah.
And thanks very much, Chris, for your.
Oh, that's fine, John. Yeah, thank you. That's a good clarification there, because they are people who are working. No, I shouldn't say working, but they've embraced a process and really are working hard to find ways in which it could be communicated. And I think that's very important. You see, traditional, the way we were brought up, I don't negate that. I am who I am today for a multitudinal reasons. I don't negate my mother, my father, my grandfather, my grandmother, even though they had very different views than I might have had. I can accept that, and I think that that's one of the most important things that we can do. The fact that life isn't very fair, that why does this happen to one person and doesn't happen to another? I have to learn to accept that. That's what an adult does. That's what a person on the road to maturity does. And so I think that I can say, if somebody holds to a very traditional Catholic Protestant view of God, then as long as they don't want to kill me, that's okay for them. I accept that. Now, as soon as you start to say that, oh, you're just wishy-washy, you'll accept anybody type of thing. No, that's rubbish. I actually do value other human beings who disagree with me. And that's fine. I just don't want to necessarily be violent toward them or them towards me because of the views that I hold. So traditional views are part of it. I mean, I like some of the liturgy. I like the symbolism. Communion for me is a symbolic act. It's meaningful. It touches the heart. I don't need to sit down and spend all my time rationalizing it or thinking about it. I can already see the metaphors and the life-giving force that joining together with the community in communion is a very powerful thing. So I think that capacity to stand with what has been in the past, to live in the present, and to imagine the future with the divine flow is really the best way of being human in the world today. Amen. So endeth the lesson. To draw from the Anglican tradition.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for everyone who's been here today. The recording of this will go up on the website, and Chris will also put his notes up there as well. So thank you. Now, before the November meeting, we'll be having the AGM. I'm sure you're all hanging out for that. So we'll send the information out about the November meeting and so forth soon. Thank you.